Again, welcome everyone. We are trying something new today. So we have folks who have signed up and are joining us via Zoom. We also have sort of a live stream to LinkedIn and Facebook. And trying something new. And we're going to get started. We know folks will still join, but we have a lot of content to share and hopefully a lot of questions to get to. So we'll get started. Good morning. I'm Gene Martin, the Executive Director of the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. NHFPI is a nonpartisan, independent research nonprofit that examines issues related to the state budget, the economy, and a variety of policy decisions that impact the financial security of granite staters. And we're particularly focused on those with low and moderate incomes. We produce regular reports on the fiscal and economic challenges facing New Hampshire, and we strive to serve as a resource to anyone who's interested in meeting those challenges. We do not lobby for or against legislation. Our goal is to provide objective data analysis to policymakers, community leaders, journalists, and the public. And one of the many ways we do that is by hosting our state budget webinar series. So thank you so much for joining the first installment as we unpack the governor's proposed budget. We've had over 700 individuals sign up to attend or request the materials, which is nearly double that of any of our webinars to date. And we offer this webinar series at no cost to attendees, thanks to the generous underwriting of our sponsors who see the value in this public good. So a special thank you to Ledyard Bank, Waypoint, and the Institute of Health and Policy Practice. While it seems like a ways off, we hope that you'll mark your calendar for the next two budget webinars, Monday, April 7th at 10:30 to examine the House Finance proposal, and Tuesday, June 3rd, also at 10:30 to take a look at the Senate's Finance Committee's proposal. And again, hope on your calendars you have saved our Friday, October 24th for 2025 Budget and Policy Conference. Today, you'll hear from our research director, Phil Sletton, our senior policy analyst, Dr. Nicole Heller, and policy analyst, Jess Williams, as they walk through different sections of the governor's proposed budget. Before I turn the floor over to Phil to start us off, friendly reminder, please submit your questions using the Q&A feature. We have 30 minutes set aside towards the end of the webinar for Q&A. And again, if you're watching this from LinkedIn or Facebook Live, please put your questions in the comments and we'll try to get to as many as possible. If we don't get to you, feel free to email us after the webinar at info@nhfpi.org. Take it away, Phil.
Great. Thank you, Gene. Let me make sure my video is working here. Good morning, everyone. Really appreciate the time that you're spending with all of us this morning. We on the research team here at NHFPI are excited to share what we've been learning about the governor's budget proposal over the last week that it's been out since it was introduced last Thursday. So a couple of ground-setting pieces of information just to make sure we are all on the same page. When we're talking about the New Hampshire state budget, we're talking about a two-year or biennial operating budget. There are other pieces of legislation that authorize expenditures that the state has, including a capital budget, the 10-year transportation improvement plan, individual pieces of legislation. So the state budget doesn't fund all state operations, but it funds most state operations for a two-year period. And these are two state fiscal years. State fiscal years are July 1st based fiscal years. So as we're approaching June 30th, 2025, that's the end of the current state budget. And right now, policymakers are considering what to include in the next state budget for the 2 years starting July 1st, 2025. So by June 30th, there has to be some form of new spending authority for the state to continue its operations that are funded through the state operating budget. And even though we call it the state budget, it's actually two separate pieces of legislation. There's the operating budget bill, or House Bill 1 as it's typically called, and that looks like what you might imagine a budget to look like. It has all the different line items for each state agency and all the appropriations next to each of those line items. And the current and the second bill is the trailer bill. It moves through the process with the operating budget bill, and it is the omnibus policy bill that includes any other language policy changes that may have to do with implementing what's in House Bill 1, or even separate appropriations can be in the trailer bill or other policy language that's not related specifically to revenues and expenditures, and those two move through the process together. If you take the appropriations that were in the operating budget bill and the trailer bill and were in effect during this budget biennium together, then the state budget allocated about $15.2 billion for state fiscal years 2024 and 2025 combined, based on the legislature's accounting and the specific appropriations that were in it. Now, where are we in the state budget process? We are actually in the middle phase, believe it or not. State agencies started putting together their state agency budget requests last summer, and they submitted their budget requests to the governor and made them public in October of last year. And the governor had a statutory deadline of February 15th to release her budget proposal. She released it on the 13th, and then the draft trailer bill on the 14th. And those two documents are what this presentation will be based on today. The budget is currently being considered by the House Finance Committee. It's in the House phase. That will have to wrap up by early April. And then the Senate will take up the budget proposal, wrap up its work by early June. And if the Senate and the House disagree, then it will go to a committee of conference to agree on a final version to go before both chambers before the governor gets the budget back for her consideration. So that's a little snapshot of the process and what the state budget is. Now, what conditions are we facing currently as we enter this new state budget biennium and policymakers are considering what's going to be funded over the next 2 state fiscal years? So let's talk about some of the fiscal constraints the state is currently facing and some of the looming questions that the state has both on the revenue side and on the expenditure side. Starting with revenues, there are some key changes relative to last fiscal year that we're going to see in the next 2 fiscal years. One is that the interest and dividends tax has been repealed, effective last month. There will be some revenue collected based on last year's activity from the interest and dividends tax, but for state fiscal years 2026 and 2027, that's no longer going to be a tax revenue source the state has that it collects any appreciable revenue. That was $184 million in state fiscal year 2024, roughly. That's the estimate. We don't have the final audited numbers yet. And it's about 8.8% of general fund revenues in that year, or a little over 5% of combined general and education trust fund revenues. The state will also earn less interest on cash holdings. It has smaller cash reserves now than it did a year ago. That's in part because the state has not been running a revenue surplus, as we'll discuss, and the state does not have as much federal funding, one-time federal funding associated with the COVID-19 pandemic as it did previously. And the state has earned interest on those cash holdings, though those interest amounts are declining over time. There are some pretty significant expenditures that are also ones the state may have to consider going into the next budget cycle. One is associated with the decades of alleged abuses, of terrible things that happened to children who are nominally in the state's care at the Youth Development Center and contracted agencies with the Youth Development Center. This has generated a significant potential liability for the state. The state has paid $127 million to settle 242 claims through its settlement process as of the end of last year. There are still 606 filed claims as of the end of last year. That total amounts of $792 million. So those are still pending. That amount may change again as the settlement process moves forward. The claims period is still open through June. The state had set aside $160 million to settle those claims previously, and outlays to pay those claims are capped at $75 million per year under state law. So that may be an ongoing $75 million expense the state would have, depending on what happens on that front. There are also court cases that are outside of the settlement process associated with the Youth Development Center and children who were in the care of the state who are not going through the settlement process and instead filed lawsuits. There's also a education funding lawsuit pending before the state Supreme Court. Education is the second single largest state expenditure. So small funding change requirements can lead to significant swings throughout the state budget. We don't know exactly what the state Supreme Court will decide. There are likely going to be 2 separate decisions that affect education funding, and the timeline of that is also up in the air in terms of when that might happen, although both of them may happen this year. There's also the construction of a new state prison for men. $10 million was set aside towards the planning of that in the current state budget. It's potentially a $500 to $600 million cost. That would not be paid all in one budget cycle, but the annual bond payments would be substantial. And there's also the potential for changes to federal funding that could affect state operations. And about 1 in 3 dollars to fund state services through the state budget come from the federal government. And to give you a sense of that, when we're looking at the organization of the state budget in New Hampshire, it's divided up into funds. This is one of the two ways that we can look holistically at the state budget. The general fund is the most flexible pot of money that policymakers have to move from priority to priority, largely because it's raised by state tax revenue and other state-generated revenue. Shares a lot of revenue sources with the Education Trust Fund. Those revenue sources are often analyzed together. You can see there's other funds, the Highway Fund, the Turnpike Fund, the Fish and Game Fund, but the largest slice of this pie are those federal funds, that blue slice. Federal funds, money from the federal government to pay for specific services through grants and partnerships that the state has with the federal government, pay for almost a third of the state budget and pay some significant expenditures outside of the state budget as well. Now, I mentioned those general fund and education trust fund revenues. How have those trended over time? If we look on over a 10-year time horizon, how have revenues compared over the most recent 12 months relative to the prior 12 months? Here you can see there have been some variations over time, including some significant variations, particularly after the immediate onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, several quarters after it started. Business tax revenues in New Hampshire started doing very well, lifted by rising national corporate profits. National corporate profits it grew dramatically during this time period in the initial period after the pandemic, and we saw that in our business profits tax base. There were other factors as well, such as real estate transfer tax revenue with housing prices increasing, pushing up that number. But if you look at the most recent data, you'll see that that green line is below zero, meaning that over the last 12 months, the state has collected less revenue, and this shows an average of $13 million a month less revenue over the last 12 months than it did over the 12 months prior to the general and education trust funds. So state revenues are lower than they were in the prior year. And that's in part because temporary revenue sources have been going away, although not all have gone away yet. I mentioned the interest on surplus funds. You can see the array of revenue sources to the general and education trust funds on this graph. All the way over on the left are the ones that have generated the most revenue relative to what the state planned for. And interest on surplus funds, you can see, has generated the most relative to what policymakers expected in their revenue projections. That amount, however, is, you can see in the blue bar next to it, lower than it was last year, even though it's higher than expectations. The interest and dividends tax revenue was also higher than expected, but again, lower than it was last year. That rate has been coming down. However, we don't see in either the last slide or this one the full impacts of interest and dividends tax repeal yet. That has not happened in the revenues yet, so that's still forthcoming. Then if you look more towards the right, you'll see the combined business profits and business enterprise tax revenues. Those are the primary drivers of revenue growth really over the last 10 years in the state. And those are well below what were expected and what came in last year in current revenues. Speaking of revenue projections, the governor did produce revenue projections associated with her budget proposal. We also have revenue projections from the House Ways and Means Committee. You can see on this graph, fiscal years 2023 through 2027, the budget projection for the current state budget is in green. The actuals are in blue. So you can see that the actuals have been outpacing what we've seen so far relative to what the budget projected. The governor's estimates are in orange. So you can see that fiscal year 2025, the estimates have gone down a little bit. This current fiscal year, we are running a deficit currently. And then in fiscal 26, it stabilizes. In fiscal 27, there's a fair bit of growth. Part of that is new revenue sources, and part of that is both in fiscal 26 and 27, the governor expects business tax revenues to grow as well as meals and rentals tax revenues. Now, I do want to note that in February, the House Ways and Means Committee earlier this month did create a projection for fiscal years 25, 26, and 27. And in aggregate across those 3 years without policy changes, the revenue estimates from the House Ways and Means Committee were about $513.5 million lower than what the governor projected over those 3 years. So that's important to remember when we're thinking about what happens in the House phase of the state budget. Where did the governor project revenue growth relative to the actual revenues in fiscal 24 and projected revenues for 2025? Where did the governor project growth in 26 and 27? Here you can see all the way over on the left, the governor did add video lottery terminals as a new revenue source. She projected that would bring in $127 million over the biennium, almost all of that in the second year as the revenue source ramps up. And then business tax revenues would be higher over the next biennium than they were in this one, as well as real estate transfer tax and meals and rentals tax revenues. Over on the right, you can see the repeal of the interest and dividends tax leads to lower revenues, about $310 million lower, because that tax is not in effect in fiscal 26 and 27. And there is a net negative change if you look at biennium to biennium for both the general and education trust funds combined in total, is that last bar on the right. So peeling back a little bit into more of what the details are of those revenue projections that the governor had, you can see here there are 3 green bars, which are the projections the governor had for fiscals 25, 26, and 27, and then 2 orange bars in different shades. The lighter shade is the compound annual growth rate for that revenue source from 2005 to 2024, unadjusted for policy changes. So policy changes that happened did affect those revenues over that time period. And then the darker shade is 2015 to 2024, so the last 10 years as opposed to the last 20. You'll notice the biggest swing here is in the Liquor Commission. And part of that is because, it's for a technical reason, that the Liquor Commission believes that there will be fewer dollars that need to be transferred away from the general fund than to other obligations that it has to the non-federal share of Medicaid expansion and the continuing appropriation it has to the Alcohol Abuse Prevention and Treatment Fund, but that non-federal share of Medicaid expansion expected to go down or at least stabilize relative to revenue growth, and then more revenue go to the general fund. So let's take out the liquor and lottery commissions for those technical reasons. What about business taxes? You can see the governor does project about 8% growth in fiscal year 26 in business tax revenues. That's in line with some of the pretty high growth that we've seen over the last 10 years, again, including that increase that we saw following the COVID-19 pandemic, but is higher than the 20-year growth rate. In the second year of the budget, the governor projects a growth rate that is lower than that 20-year growth rate. Meals and rentals tax revenues, the governor doesn't project they'll grow very robustly for the rest of this year. However, that the growth rate will match what we've seen in the last 10 years in the meals and rentals tax revenues. Tobacco tax and insurance premium tax, we see a little bit more of a mixed picture. Real estate transfer tax, the governor actually projects that through the end of this year and over the next 2 years, that the growth rate will exceed what we've seen in the last 10 years and definitely what we've seen in the last 20. And with that, I would like to hand the microphone, if you will, to policy analyst Jess Williams to talk about the categories of state expenditures.
Thank you, Phil. So appropriations in each state budget are broken down into one of 6 categories, with all state agencies and departments falling under one of these areas. As you can see in the graph, the largest slice of the pie is among the health and social services category, representing about 44% of the current budget biennium. Secondly, we have the category of education making up about 23%. When combined, these percentages have changed throughout each biennium, but health and social services and education tend to make up the largest slices of the pie, making up nearly 2/3 of the budget when combined. The categories of justice and public protection, as well as transportation, both make up similar percentages of the budget at 11% and 10% respectively. And finally, the last 2 categories of general government and research, protection, and development both make up about 6% of the current state budget. So when comparing the current budget as enacted with the governor's proposed budget for the new biennium, all 6 categories received an increase in funding. However, funding differed greatly across the board. Resource protection and development received the largest percent increase at 13%. Justice and public protection received an increase of 10%. Health and social services at 7%, with all other categories increasing by about 1 to 2%. We're going to be going over changes in each of these categories in more detail in today's presentation, but it's important to note that the education category was the only category to be funded at its full state agency request. So the category of health and social services saw an increase of over $400 million in the proposed budget. This category is the largest portion of the state budget, made up almost entirely of the state's Department of Health and Human Services. DHS's budget funds a number of critical programs and services, including Medicaid, public health services, SNAP, child care investments, as well as many others. So when comparing allocations between the adjusted authorized amount for state fiscal year 2025 and the governor's proposal for 2026, the largest monetary increase was among child protection services, encompassing about a 10 million general fund increase between the 2 years. The majority of this increase was about 16 million reserved for the Division of Child and Family Services towards funding Title IV foster care services. Another notable monetary increase included about 14 million towards the Bureau for Family Assistance for the TANF program, also known as the Temporary Assistance for Needed Families program. There was also an increase of 6 million for mental health services, with the entirety of this increase allocated towards uncompensated care at community mental health centers funded mainly with general fund dollars. The Sununu Youth Center also saw a proposed increase of about 6 million, with their budget increasing by about 47% between the adjusted authorized amount for state fiscal year 2025 and the proposed amount for 2026. The majority of these increases were allocated towards overtime pay for employees, as well as contracts for operational services. When looking at proposed decreases between the two state fiscal years, around half of the departments and agencies saw declines to their budgets. The most notable decrease is a loss of about 72 million towards Medicaid services. This is almost entirely due to ongoing discussions around hospital funding for the state's uncompensated care pool. As proposed in the budget, this would be around 156 million decline between 2025 and 2026, which Phil will discuss further on in the presentation. Some other notable decreases include about a 15 million decline for child development. This is almost entirely due to the loss of funding for child care workforce that's included in the current budget biennium, which Nicole will talk more about in the coming slides. And finally, there was also a notable decline among the Bureau for Children's Behavioral Health, with around 10 million decrease in funds for community-based services under the state's system of care. In addition to some of the other monetary increases and decreases, the governor proposed budget included some notable changes that could have an impact on services under the Department of Health and Human Services. First was the move of Hampstead Hospital off of the state budget following its recent approved lease and operational change to Dartmouth Health. Hampstead Hospital has been under the department's operation since 2022, when the state purchased the facility to transition to providing more mental health treatment in an effort to scale down some long-term wait times for inpatient mental health care. The lease of the hospital and its move off of the budget equates to a decline of about 34 million between the adjusted authorized amount for 2025 and the upcoming budget biennium. Another notable change was the reorganization of the Bureau for Healthcare Access and Policy. The around $500,000 which funded positions under this Bureau in 2025 has been moved to other departments in the budget. Smaller proposed allocation of 1 million across the biennium will go towards funding the Recovery Friendly Workplace program. However, this was a much smaller allocation compared to the around 2 million allocated in the current state budget. Overall, there does appear to be decreased funding for long-term care and supports for older adults and individuals experiencing disabilities. This includes a decline in funding for the state's Choices for Independence program between 2025 and 2026. However, the proposed budget does fall above the actual spend amount for state fiscal year 2024. This decline comes after a large increase in CF funding in the current state budget. So between the prior biennium, so state fiscal years 2022 to 2023, and the current biennium, funding for CFI services nearly doubled, or increased by about 50%. There also appears to be lower funding for developmental services in the budget lines. However, it's further supported by other non-lapsing funds from Developmental Services Fund, Acquired Brain Disorder Services Fund, and the In-Home Support Waiver Fund. This funding goes towards ensuring there continues to be no wait list for services among those with developmental disabilities. And finally, there is a mention of Medicaid copayments being included in the proposed budget. However, not much is known at this point. The Division of Medicaid Services will be presenting to the House Finance Committee this afternoon, so we'll likely gain some more insight then. However, based on available information provided in the governor's budget presentation to the committee, copayments will be capped at 5% of household income, with households with lower incomes likely required to contribute smaller cost shares. And with that, I will turn it over to Nicole.
Thank you so much, Jess. So, given the impact that childcare has on workforce development and the growth of our workforce, we wanted to spend a few moments digging into early care and education to unpack some of the investments and funding and movement that's happening in that category specifically. So, to give you context of this, these investments over time, you can see in this graph, the green and blue bars on the bottom reflect the state and federal traditional funding into this category. And from 2016 through 2025, our current fiscal year, we've seen pretty stable funding throughout this time. However, during the COVID-19 pandemic, there was an increase in one-time federal funds that came into the state in order to stabilize the industry and ensure that folks could continue going to work and making sure our childcare providers remained open. As of September of 2024, those funds were gone. We also had a $15 million designation in the 2024-2025 budget for childcare workforce grants, which were intended to help recruitment and retention of the childcare workforce. As we know, there's a shortage, likely related somewhat to some of the low wages that individuals in early care and education experience. And so those $15 million were distributed. However, they, as Jess mentioned, were not repeated in the governor's proposal. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the different categories in the Bureau of Child Development and Head Start collaboration, which is where the majority of childcare investments are placed. You can see that the Child Development Program, which houses the funding for New Hampshire's Child Care Scholarship Program, which is a state-federal partnership. So this is where state general funds will go be contributed in order for us to, as a state, to gain the match from the federal government. There's a reduction in this category. You can see that from the federal authorized 2025 in green down to the governor's proposal for fiscal year 2026. That reduction reflects in part some funding that has been moved to DCYF for protect and prevent category. So those funds weren't eliminated from the budget. They were just moved to another department. It also reflects approximately a $12 million reduction in the Child Care Scholarship Fund. Specifically, in the budget itself, this is labeled as employment-related childcare. And that $12 million for the biennium is proportional to about $6 million that was not used from the Child Care Development Fund in state fiscal year 2024. I'll remind us, however, that the Child Care Scholarship income eligibility was expanded as part of the last biennium budget. And so more families have taken advantage of this assistance to reduce their childcare costs. That program has expanded by about 46% over the past year since the program went into place. We already mentioned that the childcare workforce grants do not appear in the governor's proposal. So that's why you see the green bar in childcare workforce grants, but no blue bar. And then there was an increase in the childcare development quality assurance category. This is where our QRS funds will go to help support childcare providers to provide high quality care to the children. This was mostly related to almost a doubling for grants for public assistance and relief, and a new line listed as payments to providers for $1.5 million. We're still unpacking and learning more about those changes. I also want to highlight the Head Start State Collaborative. It looks like there's nothing in there. There is. I want to emphasize that that is federally funded, and the majority of those funds do not come through the state. The state, however, does get some funding to engage in that collaboration with Head Start providers within the state. So those numbers are just relatively small because the large amount of funding does not flow through the state for Head Start. So with that, I'm going to pass this back to Phil to talk about resource protection and development.
Okay, great. Thank you, Nicole. I really appreciate it. So on to the resource protection development category. Remember, one of those 6 categories. There's actually quite a bit happening in this category in this budget proposal. You can see here over on the left side, there's a department by department change in funding level with both the amounts in the represented in dollar terms in the size of the bar chart, and then the percentage changes labeled. And you'll see that all the way over on the left of the Department of Environmental Services, we see a pretty substantial increase, and we'll unpack that a little bit more in a moment. But some of that is just an accounting change. Sometimes the legislature and the governor, or the legislature and the state agencies, account for different funds on budget or off budget in different ways. And the department and the governor kept more funds on budget than were authorized in the state budget in the prior biennium by the legislature. So some of that is just an accounting change, but some of it is something else. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But those are basically federally funded clean water and drinking water revolving funds that had been moved off budget by the legislature and are incorporated somewhat differently in the governor's proposal. You can see there was an increase for the Fish and Game Department, a small dollar increase, but a large percentage increase for the Peas Development Authority. A lot of that appears to be wages and benefits. The Department of Business and Economic Affairs actually did see a boost in travel and tourism development funding. However, it's a negative number here because some of the one-time funding that went to support housing initiatives that Jess will talk about a little bit more later went to the Department of Business and Economic Affairs. And if you compare one budget to another budget and include that one-time funding, then it's a decrease at the Department of Business and Economic Affairs. There's also some reorganization of offices into divisions for planning and planning at the Department of Business and Economic Affairs. And then you can see a larger drop at the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. A good portion of that is there was a one-time appropriation for the Cannon Mountain Aerial Tramway of $18 million that happened in the last state budget. That's not repeated in this state budget. Indeed, as we'll talk about a little bit later, the governor has a different vision for how to use those Cannon Mountain Aerial Tramway dollars and how that work should be funded. Now, if we dive a little bit deeper into the Department of Environmental Services, why were there some of those spending swings? If you look at the graph all the way over on the right, you can see there were a reduction in those revolving loan funds, particularly due to lower expected expenditures in the Clean Water State Revolving Fund loans from the Federal Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, also known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So you'll see it that way in the budget if you're looking at those budget lines. So there is a reduction there from what the expenditures were that are authorized in state fiscal year 2025. In 2026, it goes from about that $37 million this year to a planned $20 million next year. However, if you look all the way over on the left side of the graph, you can see that the Waste Management Division saw a big increase. This is just a one-year increase in state fiscal year 2026. So the bar is showing the difference between what's authorized currently for 2025 and what we see in 2026. And that appears to be mostly due to an increase in reimbursements from the Drinking Water and Groundwater Trust Fund. Those reimbursements total $55.3 million. They may be for projects that have been completed or projects that are going to be completed. There's more digging to be done there, but that's the primary reason why we see that shift. I do want to note as well, the governor's draft trailer bill repeals a planned $30 million investment for municipal wastewater infrastructure projects that in the current budget was appropriated outside the current budget's window for fiscal years 26 and 27. Those would be repealed in the governor's draft trailer bill. So those investments that were planned but not actually formally appropriated in this budget because it's outside the budget window wouldn't be incorporated. Those laws that would make those appropriations effective in the next 2 fiscal years would be repealed. And there were a significant number of environmental policy changes as well in the governor's trailer bill. The governor proposed establishing a solid waste facility site evaluation committee. This would require approval for facilities that are not run by municipalities, so not your municipal transfer station, for example. If they're accepting over 100,000 tons of waste per year, then they have to be approved by the Solid Waste Facility Site Evaluation Committee. There's also a fee structure established, a public hearing process, and the timelines established for the decision making. The governor's trailer bill also concludes significant adjustments to Department of Environmental Services fees for dredging and terrain alteration, and bakes in adjustments for inflation. So those fees wouldn't have to be updated in the statute every time. It also eliminates a sewage system fee, a water system monitoring fee, and a requirement for power boats to have endangered species decals, and decals related to aquatic details related to aquatic environments that boats transfer between. It also defines boathouses and alters several council memberships: the Wetlands Council, the Water Council, the Air Resources Council, and the Waste Management Council. Alters the characteristics of those memberships and limits the involvement of several statewide organizations in the approval and consultation processes for projects and initiatives. And there are also some permitting changes, and these are under the umbrella of housing-related permitting changes and some of the permitting streamlining that the governor has discussed, and that Jess will discuss a little bit more, related to potentially housing projects. It basically shifts the primary point of contact for other state departments who are seeking endangered species information and impact consultation. So if a project is going to be in a critical habitat or potentially an affected endangered species, previously, there had been a requirement that state departments would go consult with the Fish and Game Department or the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. That's what's under current law, depending on whether you're talking about animals or plants. The Department of Environmental Services would now be the primary point of contact and then consult with those other two agencies if the state departments that are doing the projects, other than those three, determined that they needed to have that consultation as part of their project, that there was significant risk. And there's also an establishment of interagency fees to support the review process and place some of those time limits on those review processes. And to talk a little bit more about those, I want to hand it to Jess to talk about housing.
Thank you, Phil. So for funding for housing represents a fairly small portion of the state budget. However, allocations for funding typically fall under three different categories. The current state budget for the 2024 to 2025 biennium included a total of $50 million in federal ARPA funds towards various housing investments aimed at both increasing the development of affordable housing and providing supports for families with housing needs. Including in this $50 million was $25 million towards the Affordable Housing Fund, which provides grants and loans for developers looking to build or rehab affordable housing for those with low and moderate incomes. It's important to note that this $25 million does not include the $5 million transfer from this into the fund from the state's real estate transfer tax, which occurs each state fiscal year. In addition, the current budget included $10 million for the Invest New Hampshire Fund. This program was initially funded with $100 million in federal ARPA funds received during the COVID-19 pandemic, also providing support to developers looking to build multifamily rental housing. A smaller $5 million was allocated to the Housing Champions program, providing incentives for municipalities looking to make zoning and other infrastructure changes to support increased workforce housing. And finally, the current budget provided $10 million towards homelessness services, with this money used to increase rates paid to shelter programs, providing essential services for individuals experiencing homelessness. So when comparing the current state budget to the governor's proposed budget, allocations for these shelter rate increases are the only housing investment that has been maintained using state dollars. In addition to maintaining rates, the governor also proposed an additional $10 million from the state's opioid abatement fund to increase funding for those experiencing homelessness and also experiencing substance use disorders. All funding for shelter programs currently live under the state's Department of Health and Human Services budget. While allocations were not repeated, it's also important to note that previous funds to the Housing Champions program were extended, would now expire in state fiscal year 2027 under the proposed budget. So in addition to increases in funding for homelessness services, the governor's drafted trailer bill includes changes for developers and other entities looking to acquire permits for the construction of new housing. So under the proposed bill, state departments reviewing permit applications would be required to provide decisions within 60 days or less. However, there are a couple exceptions here. Applicants can provide written approval if they do not need a determination under the 60-day window, as well as any allotted time needed to collect needed information from applicants will not count against the 60-day timeline. If a department is unable to provide a determination under the 60-day timeline, then the permit would be automatically approved. As Phil noted before, there are also a couple of provisions regarding interactions between state agencies included in this proposed bill. Departments reviewing permits are able to consult with the state's Department of Environmental Services on any environmental matters regarding endangered species and the impacts of building units and housing in the designated location. With that, I will turn it back over to Nicole to discuss transportation.
Thank you so much, Jess. So overall, transportation funding has remained stable between our current budget and the governor's proposed budget. And when we look at the categories, activities, excuse me, you can see that it's relatively stable, very little movement in these. The largest funds are reflected in the Consolidated Federal Aid Program, the Operations Division, Highway and Turnpike divisions. These the majority of these are for things like construction repair materials, benefits and wages for workers, vehicle maintenance, as well as some of what Jess was just talking about in terms of environmental impacts and exploring those as they relate to transportation services. Something important to note about transportation, however, is there's very little general funds that go into these categories. The majority of this funding comes from the Highway Fund, Turnpike Fund, and federal funding, as well as some other grants. So other than the Rail and Transit Fund, none of the other category or activities described here are receiving general funds. So this is funded somewhat independently from general funds. So with that, we'll turn it back to Jess for justice and public protection.
Sure, my camera turns on there. Thank you, Nicole. So the category of justice and public protection saw the second highest increase to their budget, with all but one department under this category receiving an increase. So the largest and most notable increase was among the Liquor Commission. However, as Phil mentioned earlier on in the presentation, the majority of this incline is due to a difference in accounting between the two bienniums. Transfers of funds from the Liquor Commission to other agencies, such as the Alcohol Abuse Prevention Treatment Fund and the Medicaid Expansion Fund, were not included in the current budget biennium. However, they were included in the proposed budget. The state's Department of Safety saw an increase of about $20 million, with some notable increased investments. This included funds for the continuation of the state's Granite Shield program, as well as added funds for the new Northern Shield program. Both of these programs are aimed at drug trafficking prevention efforts. Together, when combined, these two SHIELD programs total about $3.5 million across the biennium. While a few other departments saw some notable monetary increases, the Justice Department saw the highest proposed percentage increase between the current budget and the new one. Some, but not all of this incline was due to large increased allocations for the Attorney General's office, including $3 million for child advocacy centers and a smaller $800,000 for funding the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force across the two-year biennium. The Judicial Council was the only agency under this category to receive a decline in their budget between the two bienniums. However, when only comparing the adjusted authorized amount for 2025 and the proposed amount for 2026, funding for the Judicial Council remained relatively the same. So outside of specific monetary allocations, the governor's budget included proposed changes to the state's current bail system. Some notable changes included the elimination of magistrates and being able to preside over bail hearings. These professionals typically handle much smaller, more minor proceedings and serve shorter terms compared to judges. The proposed bill also lowers the standard of proof and increases risk considerations when determining one's bail amount. So under the proposed change, only probable cause would be needed, and the court is able to consider a few different factors, including whether the person is at risk of committing a new crime, violating bail, or failing to appear in continued proceedings. In addition, the proposed law would increase triggers for detention without the possibility of bail. Under the proposed bill, people could be detained if they failed to appear, committed another crime, or violated bail conditions at any point, either during a previous offense or under the current one. And finally, there were some newly added consideration around child custody. In the proposed bill, the court can consider whether keeping a person in custody would leave a child without a caretaker, and in turn involve child protection services. With that, I will turn it back over to Nicole.
Thank you so much, Jess. And in the interest of time, we are going to go over K through 12 education and higher education somewhat quickly, but I do want to raise up Reaching Higher in New Hampshire put out a piece earlier this week, a webinar earlier this week, going into deeper detail on this topic. So I encourage you to also utilize that resource as you're learning more about what is in the governor's proposed budget. So with that, for the educational department, we see a 2.6% increase overall. This is inclusive of a $2.16 billion proposal for adequate education aid from the state. What you can note here is that the state fiscal year 2024 actual spending was $1.07 billion. The 2025 adjusted authorization is $1.5 billion. And in the governor's proposal, we see a slight uptick for both 2026 and 2027 of $1.08 billion each year. There's also nearly $100 million proposed for special education aid. This is a 47% increase, or that $32 million compared to the allocations for the current biennium budget that the governor spoke about in her address. And this particular category of special education aid is intended for reimbursements to school districts when they have particular students who have out of district placements or other special arrangements in which the cost to educate them exceeds 3.5 times or more the cost of their other pupils. There was also $73.5 million proposed for educational freedom accounts in the state fiscal year 2026-2027. And to give you a sense of how this account has looked over the current biennium and going into the future, in 2024, there was actually $23.8 million spent on the education freedom accounts. The adjusted authorized for our current fiscal year is $29.9 million. The governor is proposing in 2026, $29.5 million, and in 2027, $44.1 million. There's also proposed EFA phase-out grants. These are grants that go to schools whose students enroll in the EFA program to help them adjust to those students leaving. In 2026, the governor proposed $750,000, which is the same amount for the current fiscal year in 25, and then $375,000 for 2027. There's also the $1 million for grants to help school boards develop and implement policies to keep cell phones out of the classroom, and that proposed allocation would go into effect for state fiscal year 2026. So then when we move into the higher education, our first graph here is the timeline or a historic picture of the funding. You can see over time in the blue bars, the university system funding has remained relatively stable over time. If you look toward the right of the graph, you can see after 2024, it's decreased for the current fiscal year and then decreases slightly in the governor's proposal. Whereas if you look at the green bars, which are the community college system, over time, the funding for that category has increased. So in our next slide, we're going to see how this breaks down for the community college system. The system sees a 2.9% increase, which is $4 million overall. And based on the governor's executive budget summary, these funds would include $4.4 million tuition freeze so that tuition does not go up at New Hampshire's 7 community colleges. There's $6 million designated for dual and concurrent enrollment programs. These are programs designed for 10th through 12th graders in high school to take colleges at the community college level to help them gain credentialing, their associate's degrees, or work toward a 4-year degree if that's in their post-secondary plans. This is a $1 million increase than the funds that were designated for this program in 2024 and 2025. There's also $450,000 for career and technical training and workforce credentialing programs for in-demand occupations. This is a decrease of about $1.6 million for workforce credentialing programs that were appropriated in the current biennium budget. Some additional programs that received funding through the trailer bill in our current budget cycle were not mentioned in the governor's proposal or the trailer bill. This includes learning communities for high school partnerships, the Promise program, which was intended to make sure that students who were in community college could finish their program, would help them with any costs to help them finish up what they were working on there. And then first responder recruitment, retention, and development. Now, these may still be in the community college's budget, but they did not appear in the governor's proposed operating budget or the trailer bill. When we look at the university system, we're seeing a 8.3% or $16.5 million decrease. Something to keep in mind, however, is that the allocations for the 2024-2025 biennium budget included $9 million in one-time funding that came in through the trailer bill. There was $6 million for the Whittemore Center at UNH and $3 million in dedicated funds to Keene State and Plymouth State. I'd also like to remind the group about the Public Higher Education Task Force that former governor formed in order to look at aligning the community college system and the university systems. This task force put out a final report in March 2024, and 3 themes for initiatives and recommendations align with some of the proposals that we see in the governor's budget. These include increasing educational attainment, and that means getting more students access and affordable education, as well as K through 12 partnerships, which we're seeing in that concurrent and dual enrollment, administrative efficiencies of seeing how some of the overhead may be able to be combined, and then workforce and economic development, which comes through in some of those credentialing programs. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Phil to talk about government, our general government, and other changes.
Right, great. Thank you, Nicole. Thanks so much. And we're going to the last category here and some other changes that are even outside of this category. So the general government category includes some key state agencies that don't fit any of the other categories. So Department of Administrative Services, Department of Revenue Administration, the Legislative Branch, Secretary of State, the Treasury Department are in this category. And you can see here, we can look at some of the funding changes. Now I'll talk a little bit about the extremes on either end that you see here. One is that the Department of Administrative Services does see a funding decrease. A pretty significant component of that is that there were one-time funds associated with capital projects that were allocated to the Department of Administrative Services in the current state budget that aren't repeated in the new state budget. Purchasing a building and doing some retrofitting, that was paid for with cash in the current state budget and shows up in that way and doesn't show up again in the new state budget because those were one-time expenses. And all the way over on the left side, you can see an increase in the retirement system. And we'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. One thing I do want to note here is what you see measured as the Treasury Department. That is adjusting for changes across budgets. There's actually a pretty significant change associated with the municipal funds transfer. We did on this graph adjust for that change, so it's a little bit more of an apples to apples comparisons and not flummoxed, if you will, by some of the complications of how the accounting is done across 2 different versions of the state budget. Now, I mentioned those retirement system changes. The governor had proposed putting an additional $32.9 million in general funds towards the retirement system changes for police and fire personnel. These are so-called Group 2 personnel who are participating in the retirement system. And there would be an additional $27.5 million each year through 2034 in the law the governor proposed. This is focused on enrollees who lost benefits during some system changes around the time of 2011. And it's pretty similar to House-passed legislation that was attached to the House version of the state budget in 2023, but it's not exactly the same. Some of the key participation benchmark timelines are actually a little bit later, as opposed to January 1st, 2013. They're set back to September 1st, 2013. And there's some expansions to modified disability service and early retirement benefits as well. So it's not exactly the same as what the House considered 2 years ago in the state budget and approved 2 years ago in the state budget, but it is relatively similar. Or at least appears that way as it's written in the draft trailer bill. Again, there's maybe more information to come. The governor also would authorize the renamed State Lottery and Gaming Commission, so it wouldn't be just the Lottery Commission anymore, but also specifically include gaming, to oversee video lottery terminals at licensed locations. There's a wager cap of $25. There are requirements in terms of how the funding is split over time among different either going to charitable organizations that are contracting with those licensed locations, and the revenue the state collects would be split evenly between the general fund and the education trust fund, which is unusual because oftentimes, or most of the time, except for this, lottery commission revenue goes solely to the education trust fund. And one thing to note as well about some of the splits in revenue that's currently being collected, the governor would harmonize some of these splits across 4 revenue sources that are currently shared between the general fund and the education trust fund, then define those splits in a way that is consistent across those. So what do I mean? For example, the business profits tax and the business enterprise tax are currently split 59% general fund, 41% education trust fund. The governor's proposal would lower it to 34% and also redefine the splits for the real estate transfer tax and the tobacco tax to be 34% for revenue collected from those 2 tax revenue sources going to the education trust fund. This overall would direct $176.4 million in the state's estimates, less revenue to the education trust fund and more to the general fund. Now, it's worth noting that if the education trust fund has a shortfall, the general fund is an automatic backstop. So switching funds from the education trust fund to the general fund doesn't mean that there are fewer education services funded. It just means that more of them would have to be funded through the general fund as opposed to the education trust fund. Now, it does mean that a dollar that previously would have gone to the education trust fund and remained in that fund, because it does behave as a trust fund and keeps the unspent amounts in that fund, would instead go to the general fund and be used more flexibly by policymakers. Okay, so what does this all add up to? Oh, pardon me. What does this all add up to? You've just heard from Nicole and Jess and me about all of the appropriations that are made in the budget. You've heard some about the revenue estimates. What does it add up to in terms of sizes, and what are some of the shifts that happen to make it work? So the budget does grow overall. If you compare the budget as approved by the legislature in June 2023, the current state budget, and the specific appropriations that made, to the governor's proposal and the specific appropriations that, as far as we can tell, without the final version of the trailer bill, that it makes, then the budget grows by 5% if you compare the 2 years to the 2 years. It's a little different if you compare year over year, but that is the overall increase in the bottom line totals. Now, if you took the funds that the legislature moved off budget in the current budget cycle and incorporate those back in, not all of which are incorporated in sort of direct comparison in the governor's budget proposal, but maybe in some places, then that total growth would be a 1.2% growth and not a 5% growth. So that's likely below future cost inflation in these services. But again, those accounting changes do complicate the actual A to B comparisons. The current state budget includes nearly $300 million, or about $300 million in expenditures that could be categorized as one-time, and some of which is a result of surplus funding that was available at the end of fiscal 23 that was wrapped into the current state budget. So that's the total picture. How does that picture compare if we look for each iteration of the state budget? Remember, the governor, the House, the Senate, and the final version of the state budget all differ, or all may differ. And you can see the agency budget requests here. So the 22-23 totals are in green, the 24-25 totals are in blue, and orange has the 26-27 totals that are the state agency efficiency requests, the total requests, and the governor's budget proposal so far. So it's not a surprise that the governor's budget proposal is lower than what we see, particularly in the full agency request, and is also a bit lower than the efficiency budget request. That happens commonly. But here you can see the House and the Senate and those accounting changes that are made in the House and the Senate phases that tend to make the top line of the budget look smaller, although authorize a similar amount of services. There are some funding changes that actually do change those services, however, and that shows up in these bars as well. Looking over a longer time horizon, how does the governor's budget compare? Well, the growth rate that we see in the governor's budget proposal, if it were enacted as written currently, and again, as far as we know from the trailer bill, you can see that that growth rate is relatively in line. It's a smaller growth rate than the last state budget, larger than the one before. And you can see the first year of a budget biennium also often has a little bit more of a bump. That's in part because of surplus funds that are allocated, although there will not be surplus funds available this time in the governor's projections. We'll talk about that in a moment. So here's the total trajectory of the broken out federal funds, general funds, and all other funds. Now, some of those accounting changes do affect those other funds and those federal funds. General funds are a little bit more stable, right? They're a little bit more, they have to be appropriated generally through the state budget or some other piece of legislation. So how do those compare over time if we just look at general fund appropriations? And the governor mentioned in her budget address the decline in budget and general fund appropriations year over year. If we look at the history of general fund appropriations in each state budget, which you can see on the graph from the 2018-2019 biennium to the most recent one, you'll see that from the current budget to the governor's proposal, there's actually about a $200 million reduction in general funds. And that's a significant amount. However, if we look at the reasons for that, about 133 million of that reduction is in the Medicaid managed care appropriation. And that is likely directly tied to, without getting too far in the weeds, the way Medicaid enhancement tax funding flows in the state. And right now, there is not an agreement yet between the state's hospitals and the state government as to how to appropriate those Medicaid enhancement tax funds. And that's a tax on hospitals in the state. So the uncompensated care line that's currently in the state budget is substantially lower than that in the governor's proposal than it is in the current state budget. And that allowed more of those general funds to be saved and not spent because there were more funds available through the Medicaid enhancement tax that offset those general funds. It's a complex thing. I'm happy to answer questions about it later, but that's part of the reason why we see that reduction, which means that if there's an agreement between the hospitals and the state that affects the state budget, it likely will affect that line and may affect where the decline that you see here in general fund appropriations. General fund changes are generally pretty limited outside of the health and social services category. And it's also worth noting that there's less general and education trust fund revenue in total, although the governor shifted more funds towards the general fund and less to the education trust fund. Now, the governor does use both to balance the current state budget and the next one, uses some other funds. The governor assumes there's $70 million in underspending by state agencies at the end of this biennium, and also that the state will have to pull $81 million from the Revenue Stabilization Reserve account, commonly called the Rainy Day Fund, to balance its budget at the end of this biennium in June because of the current revenue deficit. The governor would also repurpose $18 million in general funds currently appropriated for the Cannon Mountain Aerial Tramway and proposes shifting that to the capital budget with a $20 million appropriation there that can be bonded and borrowed against. And there's also a $10 million transfer from the Renewable Energy Fund to the general fund, so using it for not renewable energy fund purposes. And the governor does, in her plan, spend down the education trust fund balance, which is projected to be $128.9 million at the beginning of the biennium to $14 million at the end. All right, so thematically, what does this all mean? Well, the governor's budget proposal arrives in a constrained fiscal environment. There are lower revenues, potentially significant looming expenditures, such as those YDC settlements and several court cases. And there are key uncertainties that are both in those court cases and also on the federal level. The governor overall maintained most agency budgets. There are relatively few significant changes in either direction after you adjust for some of the accounting differences. They're supported by favorable revenue estimates and some new lottery revenue. There are significant new investments in retirement system contributions, targeted special education aid to schools, the education freedom account expansion, nursing facility and developmental services funding, especially some of those off-budget developmental services fundings, and services for unhoused residents. We see some significant new or increased investments there. There's also potential changes to hospitals, as I just mentioned, hospital payments that could affect Medicaid throughout, and reductions in the Choices for Independence and university system funding levels that are potentially key areas of change going forward. There are also some significant policy changes, bail law changes, waste facility process, the waste facility siting process, and other environmental policy changes, and Medicaid co-payments as well. And there's no indication dollars have been set aside for youth development center settlements or continued work on the state prison for men in the governor's budget proposal. So those are two, again, potential expenses that are not being addressed here, at least in a way that's clear to us at this point. There's still more to learn when we get the final trailer bill language, as well as learning more of what agencies unpack in their hearings with state legislators. And it's important to remember, House revenue projections are currently significantly lower than the governor forecast, and that would lead to a more constrained appropriation environment that relative to what the House does in its budget cycle, or in its budget phase. And with that, I'm happy to welcome Jean and Nicole and Jess back on to address as many questions as we can in the next 23 minutes or so.
Thank you so much. Enjoy a sip of water, everyone. That was a lot to unpack, and certainly within less than a week to really sort of do into that. Phil, the first question I'll throw to you. There are a few questions. Just a reminder: what is the trailer bill, and why isn't it out yet in the official House Bill 2 language?
Yeah, it's a great question. So New Hampshire has a trailer bill that moves through the process with the state budget, in part because there's a constitutional requirement that was put into the state constitution, I believe in 1984. I think I'm fairly certain it was the 1980s, that says that there is that the budget bill has to deal with just revenues and expenditures. So House Bill 1 is limited in what it can touch relative to other policies. Sometimes, however, you need policy changes to implement what's in House Bill 1, and that's why there's House Bill 2. That's why there's a trailer bill to implement those policy changes. However, anything can be attached to House Bill 2. It does not have to specifically address those revenues and expenditures and how those change. So the trailer bill moves through the process with the operating budget bill. They have the same hearings, right? It's the same hearing for House Bill 1 and House Bill 2. There's a strong interaction between the two. But when you hear about policy attached to the state budget, that's in the trailer bill, or it's very, very likely that it's in the trailer bill. Some policies can be attached if they deal with revenues and expenditures to House Bill 1. So the trailer bill, we don't have the final version yet because it is a big, omnibus, multifaceted piece of legislation. The governor has a quick turnaround time, right? She took office in early January, and she has a statutory deadline of February 15th to have her budget proposal out. The legislature it used to be that the trailer bill would actually come out significantly later, and the legislature has imposed more and more stringent requirements on the governor to accelerate that timeline. And now the governor is complying with a statute that says, if you don't have the trailer bill finished, because sometimes it takes a long time to process these edits, put them into final legal form at the Office of Legislative Services, the law says now, if you don't have time to, if we get to February 15th, you have to have something posted publicly. And what we have now is, this is the first iteration that we sort of have in full on a timely manner, the draft version of the trailer bill. So that trailer bill draft is what we're working on right now, but it's not the final version yet.
Thank you for that. And we did put a link in the chat. If you go to the link that was shared, you'll be able to access all of the documents. Feel free to bookmark that. I know we all do, and everything that's happening throughout this process, gets publicly posted there. So sort of keep monitoring that. There were a number of questions about what's going on at the federal level and what that means for New Hampshire. So I'm just wondering, what happens if the federal government reduces funding to the state, and what impact does that have on the state budget and New Hampshire residents?
So I'll speak briefly generally, and then about Medicaid, and Nicole, I'll hand it to you as well to talk a little bit more about federal funds too. So federal funds are a revenue source, right? It's not a revenue source like any other because they're for specific programs and have to meet those parameters, but they're a revenue source for the state. For example, Medicaid is, if we look at last fiscal year, fiscal 24, federal Medicaid dollars were the single largest source of state revenue the state collected, right? If you count them all together, there was $1.4 billion in federal funds that came into the state through the Medicaid program. That's larger than what the state collected in its largest tax revenue source, which is the business profits tax, and larger than any other single source, larger than gross liquor and lottery sales, et cetera, or I should say liquor and lottery sales individually, larger than those. So if the state received fewer funds, then it would have to respond to that by either raising more revenue, reducing services, or some combination of the two, whether it's backfilling those specific services with new revenue or making changes elsewhere in the budget. And that's part of why Medicaid is so important in this conversation, because Medicaid is the single largest program the state operates. And there are two proposals that are that we've been able to measure at NHFPI what the implications would be for New Hampshire. If they were both fully implemented, then this fiscal year, Medicaid, if they were both fully implemented at the federal level in this fiscal year, then the state would have to find nearly $500 million more in revenue to fund the same Medicaid services. So small changes to Medicaid, much smaller than that, could have significant impacts throughout the state budget, including in some other places. And Nicole, I'll hand it to you to elaborate a little bit more.
Sure, thanks, Phil. So there is an FMAP component. This is essentially the rate at which New Hampshire needs to match our federal funds in order to get the federal funds. So we have to put a little bit of funding in, or sometimes a lot of funding in order to draw down federal funds. And currently our FMAP rate, which informs the numbers that Phil just shared about Medicaid, is also used to calculate some of the other funding mechanisms that we have in the state, including the child care development funds that I spoke about earlier. And so though we'll talk a lot about Medicaid as a potentially large impact related to any changes to federal rules around FMAP, those can have some other ripple effects across the budget.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Speaking about Medicaid, we've had a few questions about the co-pays, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the answer is we don't have a lot of detail on that based on what we've looked. Is that a fair assessment?
Okay. Yeah, this is something we'll still have to learn more about. We'll likely hear some more this afternoon when the Medicaid director presents his proposal or presents the budget to the committee. We'll likely hear more about those co-payments then.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Look, there are a number of questions, and sorry if we don't get to everyone's question, but I'm trying to sort of push them together here. But this new video lottery terminal, it seems like this is the largest new revenue source entering the budget. Correct me if I'm wrong. So that was a question someone had. You're shaking the head yes, so I think it's fair to say that's the newest piece. Just wondering what that means for, we might not know yet, but for other lottery sources around the sort of other charitable gaming things that are happening. Do we think this is going to take money away from that, or is it too soon to have those answers?
Yes, so I don't have definitive answers at this point. The governor did address a question about that at the House Finance Committee when she presented her budget proposal a week ago, last Friday. There is some consideration of how many lottery dollars are out there, right? Is this just an expansion? And will it reach more people, or will it take people away from other lottery activities at this point? Will it bring more people into the state across borders, right? To do a different kind of gaming in New Hampshire that maybe they can't do in neighboring states, or maybe more limited or have other limitations on them in neighboring states? These are, I think, very important questions. I do think it's noteworthy that the governor's revenue projections for the rest of the lottery commission, once the video lottery terminals are fully phased in, the governor's revenue projections for the rest of the lottery commissions revenues are flat. So that suggests that maybe there's quite a bit of uncertainty around, will lottery revenues continue to grow, or will they be, either eaten into or the growth rate be reduced by having an additional, in fiscal 27, $117 million come in through video lottery terminals. That being said, the lottery commission revenues have grown substantially over time. If you look at sort of a 10-year time horizon, it's the second fastest growing revenue source the state has, after the business profits tax revenues. So I think there's room for growth, but I don't know what that looks like with this particular initiative, particularly because those prior expansions have been relatively small. Things like mobile gaming and Keno, important and have contributed to the overall growth, but this is a pretty significant amount of revenue that the governor's projecting, which again supports a lot of the ongoing expenditures being held where they are.
Thanks so much. And this is a great example of why House Bill 2 or the trailer bill is so important, because this doesn't exist currently. There is a Senate bill that would sort of allow for, I believe, 4,500 new sort of slots, and there's a tax on that to be able to generate the revenue. So that's why watching the trailer bill is so important, because any new policy change has to be spelled out in that. So we'll move on. Phil, I know you mentioned sort of, we mentioned sort of CFI funding, and I'm just wondering if we can sort of clarify. We talked about a slight reduction in spend, but sort of based off of the 24, I'm just wondering, thinking about this sort of pieces, is that spend because in 24 the program was being set up, or was there a delay in that? I think folks were asking, why was the spend in 24 so low if there was new investment in the program?
Right, so I want to hand it to Jess if you want to speak to this, or do you want me to speak to it, Jess?
I can speak to the numbers in particular, and then you can
Sure.
feel free to fill in anything I might have missed, as well as some historical context. So when looking at the budget, there does appear that the governor's proposed budget for 2026 is higher than the actual spend in 2024. The actual spend in 2024 was about $2 million proposed towards the CFI services. In 2026, we're seeing that at about 2.4 million. So it would be higher. However, the proposed governor's proposal for 2027 does see a slight increase. We're looking at about 2.5 million. So increase in the second year of the biennium. I mentioned in the presentation that funding for CFI increased by about 50% between the last biennium and the current one, likely closing a decades-long gap in funding for such services. So when we're looking towards this budget, it does not necessarily mean a decline in services, but potential declines in opportunities for growth in CFI services. And I feel free to fill in anything I might have missed.
Yeah, and I think that increase is from the prior budget to the current one, not the governor's as we're discussing for the next one, but from the prior budget 22-23 to the current one. It's important context, because that 50% increase is if we were to spend all the money, match all the funds from the federal government through Medicaid, that would, because CFI is a Medicaid program, that would have increased the appropriation from roughly 70 some million to up to I think it was near 120 million or so. So that's and that's looking at all components of the CFI program together. So that appropriation increase, even though you increase dollars for it, and there were Medicaid reimbursement rate increases in the current budget, or in the budget as well, and those don't happen immediately. And they also don't mean you've hired staff immediately. They don't mean you're able to deliver the services immediately. So some of the Medicaid reimbursement rate increases were delayed until past the first 6 months of the current budget biennium. And that means that when you're looking at fiscal 24, some increases went to CFI earlier than that. But if you're looking at fiscal 24, then there may be some time that requires ramp up for those services. So the fiscal 25 spend, I think, will be very informative. Now, with that big of a budget increase, then there's a question of how long does it take those services to catch up? And is there some adjustment that's needed after you have that significant increase? That being said, these services are, they're much less expensive than nursing facility services. It's in-home and community-based care as opposed to facility-based care. So, calibrating exactly what the need is for that, what the demand is for that. And we have a lot of evidence that there's a lot of demand being unmet, at least during the funding in the prior budget biennium. That is, I think, informs what we look at when we say fiscal 24, the actual spend is lower. the budgeted amount is higher in fiscal 25 than what we see the governor propose in fiscal 26. And it's important context because there's the ramp up of services in fiscal 24 was probably still a ramp up, and fiscal 25 will be informative.
And we know sometimes that happens with state programs that are enacted on July 1, but they take time to sort of stand up and sort of, Nicole, I'm wondering, we had a question about unspent dollars in 2024 for child development. I'm wondering, is that sort of similar, the similar piece, and how much was left unspent in that year?
Sure, yeah. So I'm looking at a fiscal note, so forgive my cheat sheet here. But in state fiscal year 2024, there was about 6.1 million left over, specifically in the line allocated for employment related childcare, which is the funding for our New Hampshire Child Care Scholarship Program. And so what I was saying on that slide is that the $12 million decrease in that specific line in the governor's proposed budget may reflect the unused funds from fiscal year 2024 across the biennium. That said, the quarterly report that goes to the fiscal committee on this particular line item showed quite an uptick in the fourth quarter, and that likely reflects the expansion of the child care scholarship program. And we also, as a state, last legislative cycle, expanded child care assistance temporarily to the child care workforce. So there may be more draws on this particular budget line as more families may start using the child care scholarship. And if there are child care workers who fall into the original category, which is 85th percentile of the state median income, as opposed to childcare workers who fall within the 85th percentile and the 100th percentile, who would be, their childcare assistance would be funded through general funds. So we're not, as a state, sure, we can't predict how many more families may enroll in the program to know what the drawdown would be on that particular budget line.
Thank you so much. There was a question about support for veterans, and I think it was sort of highlighting the fact that in fiscal 26, there's a reduction for spend and then followed by a small increase in 27. Do we have any sense what this will mean for process times? This questioner has shared that he's heard that the process times remain woefully long.
I don't have particular insight into what that might mean for what those funding changes as proposed might mean for process times. Jess, I'll look to you. I don't know if you've taken a harder look at that budget line than I have or not, but I don't have the context to be able to say how that might result in a services change there.
Yeah, I don't have any additional information to provide. That's something I'd have to look more into.
And important to note on that link that was shared earlier that has the House Bill 2 text, if you go into the House Finance Committee, you'll be able to see some of the presentations and you'll see links to those. You'll be able to go back and look at them. But there's a lot of detail that's happening in these presentations. For example, the Chief Justice, when he presented to the House Committee recently, talked about if this budget was enacted as proposed, that you'd have to close sort of things and sort of suspend trials in certain months of the year, things like that. So there's a lot of details that the department heads are sharing. And so important to sort of keep track of that. And as we go through the process, we'll continue to sort of keep folks updated as best we can. With the time we have left, we had a few questions about what happens next. And Phil, and I think in the last slide, the last bullet, you highlighted that the revenues that the governor has shared are different from what the House has proposed. Can you sort of talk us through the next step and what does the House Ways and Means Committee do? How does that interact with the House Finance Committee? And then moving us towards sort of the April deadline.
Yeah, so the House Ways and Means Committee has produced a set of revenue estimates that are different from the governor's. Again, we're talking about roughly a $513.5 million difference in current law. The governor actually makes that difference larger because she has proposed additional revenue sources, and the House hasn't settled on that yet. But what the House Ways and Means Committee does, and the Senate Ways and Means Committee does in the Senate phase, is takes a look at current law, takes a look at the revenue sources, and says, here's what we project over the next 2 years, right? The rest of this fiscal year, which affects whether there's how much surplus or deficit there is to affect the next state budget, and then over the next 2 fiscal years. It's a very difficult job projecting revenue over that time period. The House Ways and Means Committee comes up with its own revenue estimates. They don't, they have a separate process for doing it, separate from the governor's process. And those estimates are then actually put in a House resolution. The House can vote to approve that resolution. And those are then the estimates that are adopted by the House Finance Committee when they are building the House version, or what may become the eventual House version of the state budget. So constrained revenue estimates in the House, right, more constrained than what the governor proposed, means that the House Finance Committee has effectively less money, unless they decided to raise money from additional sources, less money than the governor has to appropriate dollars to state services. The Senate Ways and Means Committee will also look at their revenue estimates probably in early May, so when they have the benefit of the March and April revenue returns, which are two very big months for state revenues because of tax returns from the prior year, particularly for the business taxes. When they have those March and April returns in, they may have a clearer view of what state revenues look like over the next 2 years, and they'll produce another set of revenue estimates. Finally, Committee of Conference can also have a separate set of revenue estimates as well.
Okay. And just to sort of summarize for folks, House Ways and Means Committee sort of sets the revenue targets, and historically they've done that in a very bipartisan way. I believe there was an 18-0 vote to sort of confirm these sort of revenue estimates. And so then the House Finance Committee in its divisions will go through and sort of workshop these revenues. And obviously, if the revenues are lower than what the governor's presented, there likely will be reductions to agencies. Is that a fair sort of process?
The lower revenue estimates mean that there have to be adjustments to revenues and expenditures relative to what the governor had proposed, because the House wouldn't have a balanced budget plan with the House revenue estimates and the governor's expenditures.
Thank you so much. And so we have, I'm not sure if we have time for one more question, but just to sort of note, the slides have been posted. That link has been shared. We will share this recording around. Unfortunately, we didn't get to everyone's questions, but we'll do our best. If you have any lingering questions, you can feel free to email us. We'll put that email in the chat, and we'll do our best to follow up. And thanks again for taking some time on a Friday to join us, and we'll see you all soon.